Hello, I'm Colette E. I'm the Chief Publishing Officer here at the American Physiological Society, and I'm speaking with Tracey Weissgerber, who is a member of APS's Publications Committee. And Tracey, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your areas of research?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to be talking to you today. So my name is Tracey Weissgerber, and I am a physiologist by training, but I now focus my research mostly on meta-research, or the science of science, which means I study research itself and ways that we can make research more transparent, more rigorous, more reproducible, and more useful to science and society, and more trustworthy. So I'm currently based at the Berlin Institute of Health in Berlin, and my group does a lot of work on improving the quality of data visualization, of open and transparent methods and protocols reporting, as well as other aspects of scientific reporting. And then we also do a lot of development of automated screening tools to screen papers to identify common problems or beneficial practices, and give authors customized feedback about their work.
Wonderful. So we're so lucky to have you on the Publications Committee. It's so relevant to the things we're doing today with APS journals in particular. I wonder if you could help our audience by explaining your view on what open science is. And maybe you can give a few examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a challenging question because there are so many things that go into open science, and to some extent, it depends on the field that you're from. At its most basic level, open science is about making our materials and our products of the scientific work that we do more open, more available and accessible to others, and making our scientific process more transparent. And so that might include sharing the data that we generated on a data repository so that others can reuse it for different studies. It might include sharing the code that you use to analyze the data, the protocol, either a protocol for your entire research study or a protocol that's step-by-step reusable protocol for a specific procedure that you're performing as a part of your research. It can also include making a software or a tool that you have developed openly available to others, or making educational resources that you've created open so that others can reuse those things. And one of the things that's really critical to open science is that we diversify our understanding about what a research output is. So right now, our system is very focused on publications, which are primarily about the results and the new findings that we have generated. But when we think about it, a lot of the work really goes into creating these many other pieces, the data, the code, developing the methods and the procedures. And some of those things may in fact be far more useful to our colleagues than just knowing the results that we generated. And so allowing them to reuse our methods, our data, and to cite those materials, and so that the researchers who've created those materials can get credit for their work is really important. The other piece of open science that is considered a part of open science in some fields and a bit different in others is about scientific rigor and reproducibility. So just making something open doesn't mean that it's high quality. We also want to know about the experimental design. We want to know if the authors are using procedures like blinding or randomization or pre-registration to help us evaluate the risk of bias and the quality of the way that the study was done. And this information is really important because it tells us about how useful the results might be, how much confidence we should have in those results, what kind of follow-up work might be needed or nuance in the interpretation. And it's also crucial to have this information when we're thinking about reusing others' work. So we can't reuse data responsibly if we don't know how those data were generated. We won't know whether they're likely to give us trustworthy results. We won't know whether the data that we're using are in fact appropriate to answer our research question. So at its most basic level, open science is thinking more broadly about our research products and making more of those different stages of the project of the research product open and accessible to others. And then we also want to be thinking about the quality of those products, about how they're leading us towards rigorous and reproducible science that's trustworthy and that's useful for scientists and society.
Wow, that's really helpful. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of open science as it relates specifically to biomedical research? Do you think there's a specific aspect of biomedical research that makes it particularly important, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's especially important about biomedical research is that we ultimately want therapies that work for patients. We want things that translate, that make people's lives better, that help patients with, to get treatment for their diseases earlier, and that solve problems in the world. And so I think it's really important to go beyond thinking about what do I need to do as a scientist to build my career, and also to think about what is the end goal of this? Like, who is my research trying to help? What is the end result of that research, and how is it going to impact others? Which in the case of biomedical research is often patients and clinical care. And making our materials open, making them high quality, making them rigorous and trustworthy and useful to others can help us accelerate that process of discovery. So if we can reuse someone's methods, then it's faster for us to get up and running with something new and to be adapting that for our own circumstances. But in order to do that, we have to change the way that we assess scientists. So we need to go beyond rewarding people for their grants and their publications. And we need to start also rewarding them for those other types of research outputs they produce, so that someone who's generating great methods that a lot of people can use can be rewarded for that. And someone who's generating great data sets that a lot of other people use is rewarded for that. And someone who's creating really cool software tools or educational materials that are helping to advance their field can be rewarded for that. Right now, there's one way to be a successful scientist, and it's about grants and papers which focus on results. And when you're focusing just on the results, you incentivize people to keep their methods and their data private because they want to have those things to generate more new results as a competitive advantage. If we were to open up what we think of as a research output and start giving credit to people who are good in these other areas, we would provide more paths for being a successful scientist, and we would reward people who are doing great work, not in the area of making results. That's really fundamental for allowing science to advance quickly and efficiently.
Great. What do you have a perspective on what you think are the most impactful open science practices and recommendations? If say APS really wanted to move the needle, what would make the most impact?
Yeah, I think if you ask 10 different people in open science this question, you will get 10 different answers. And I will acknowledge that I have my bias in my answer before I tell you what that answer is. So right now in open science, there's a lot of emphasis on open access, which is publications, on open data. So many of you will have heard about fair data, and on open code. And we're starting to hear more conversation about open software. What we're not hearing much about is open methods. And I think this is a huge oversight because several reasons. First of all, reproducibility starts with methods. So if we don't know what you did, we can't reproduce it and we can't implement it in another setting. The second reason is that if you care about open data and you want to be able to reuse that data, you have to understand how it was generated to use it responsibly. You need to know the methods used to generate it, so you know whether it's appropriate for your research question, whether it's going to give you trustworthy results, whether there are limitations in how you can interpret that data or that affect your decision about which data set to reuse. So methods are critical. And then the third reason is that of all of the things that science produces, methods are perhaps one of the most useful. It's more likely that someone might be able to reuse your methods or adapt them for another context than they would be able to reuse your data. And so I think this overlooking of methods is a huge oversight, and I would really encourage scientists to look at how to use protocol repositories, how to share their reusable step-by-step protocols and publish their study design protocols so that others can understand and use these things. And related to this, I'm currently organizing a group called PROMAP, which stands for Promoting Reusable and Open Methods and Protocols. And we have just released draft recommendations for actions that 4 stakeholder groups can take to improve editors, researchers, research institutions, and departments. We're currently undergoing a consultation phase, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in providing input on the recommendations for one of those 4 stakeholder groups to contact me and join a consultation session to share your feedback, and we will use that feedback to include the final recommendations. So, in summary to my long answer, to me, the most important thing to make progress on is open methods and sharing our reusable step-by-step protocols, and getting this information well documented, both because it makes your own lab run more efficiently. It captures undocumented knowledge. It makes it easier to train new people to go back to methods that you've used in the past but haven't used for a while, even if the person working on them has left the lab. And also because it allows others to then reuse that resource, which can help you build collaborations and strengthen your own work.
Great. What, in your view, are some of the challenges of open science?
The first big challenge is that right now it's not adequately rewarded or incentivized. So if we think about making our data available, our protocols available, our code available, our software available, each of those steps takes time. And there is some discussion that doing these things early saves you time in the future and makes it easier for you to go back to your own work and get credit for other pieces. But right now, we're still not adequately rewarding people who take the extra time to do these practices. And this is a huge problem because right now, people who make their data and their code and their methods available are doing more work for the same unit of credit, which is one publication. And that's why it's so important that we start recognizing these other research outputs. The second challenge we have is a knowledge gap. So a lot of people simply aren't aware of practices that they could be using or tools. And some of these tools are fairly new. So supervisors who have been working in the field for a while may have gone through their training at a time when these tools weren't thought of and didn't exist yet. So there's a lot of training to be done to get people to understand, how do I use these tools and how do I integrate them into my everyday practice effectively and efficiently, and how does that benefit my research group? There are a lot of training resources available. At our institution, we run a very hands-on training program called Reproducible Teach, where participants learn a new practice each week, and then during class, they really focus on implementing those skills in their own practice. All of the skills that we're teaching are available online on our YouTube channel, which is Reproducible Teach, and anyone can find them and use them. And we're happy to talk to other people about how to implement the hands-on portion of that class at their own center. The last thing is resources. Some of these skills, in addition to time, which is a resource, also take resources to implement. You may need infrastructure, you may need personnel, and there are costs associated with that. And the challenge for scientists is if they have so much funding on a grant, they always want to put it into the science. And so thinking about a change in the way that we fund science so that funding these practices that are part of good science is simply a part of the budget as standard is really important to make sure that we are leaving adequate resources to support investigators in doing reproducible, rigorous, and open research work.
So I'm curious, one of the first things you mentioned was recognition. Do you feel that's a role that funders should be playing, institutions should be playing? Who's really responsible for trying to change that culture of recognition from your perspective?
Yeah, I think everyone is responsible for playing that culture or for changing culture. It's a question of what each of us can do, both as individuals, as organizations, and in the role that we play. So we published a guideline last year called Recommendations for Empowering Early Career Researchers to Improve Research Culture and Practice that deals with some of those issues. Early career researchers are really important in making these changes because they are on the front line. They are the ones that are often having the time available to get training and the passion to get training about how to implement these new practices and then trying it out in their own work and bringing it back into their research groups. And this isn't just about open science practices. It's also about making research cultures more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, more environmentally sustainable. There are a whole group of things, including good mentorship, that come along with research culture and practice changes beyond open science. So early career researchers are really important, but it's very hard for them to change the system because their efforts in this space often aren't recognized or rewarded for career progression. And sometimes they're actively discouraged from doing this because it's seen as taking time away from getting publications and grants to advance their career. They don't have as much power. They're not in decision-making roles. They're often at the bottom of the hierarchy and they're moving between institutions frequently. And so in that set of guidelines, we really look at what institutions and scientific societies and funding agencies and mentors and supervisors can do to support early career researchers who want to make those change. And we give specific recommended actions for each individual based on their role. And I would say that there are also things that you can do if you are members of curriculum committees in terms of making sure that new practices for reproducible research and new tools are being taught at your institution. There are things that you can do if you are on hiring and evaluation committees and tenure promotion committees to change the discussion around what criteria are you rewarding? Are you collecting information on publication and grants, or are you also collecting information on open methods, on open code and open data sets and other outputs that people are creating to reward them for doing that work?
Wonderful. I'm kind of curious, and I might anticipate your answer on this, but I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of platforms or repositories that you think are best positioned to help support open science that you want our readership to know about.
Yeah, so I think the question about repositories always depends on what it is that you are depositing. So repositories come in different types. There are generalist repositories, which mean you can put anything there. So you can put your educational resources, your talks, your data, your code, your methods, anything you want. And then there are other repositories that are dedicated to specific types of research outputs. So for example, Protocols.io is a repository where you can deposit protocols, step-by-step reusable protocols. That's all they do. If you are wanting to deposit a study design protocol for a systematic review, you might use Prospero. If you're wanting to deposit a study design protocol for a clinical trial, you might use clinicaltrials.gov. We have the same type of thing in data repositories. So there are generalist repositories, and then there are specific repositories that are tailored for particular types of data sets. The general rule for data is that if there is a specialist repository that is specifically tailored for your type of data set, it's really helpful to use that repository because they will be set up to capture your specific type of data. If there isn't, then you're going to use a generalist repository, and that might include something like Dryad or Zenodo. In terms of the generalist repositories that take any kinds of output, where you can put all sorts of different things for a project, the Open Science Framework, or OSF, would be an example of one of those.
And do you have any suggestions of groups or organizations that you feel are really leading the efforts that people can get more involved or track, in order to learn more?
Yeah, this is also a hard one to answer because a lot depends on the specific practice that you're interested in, as well as the field or scientific background that you are coming from. If you're new to the area, I would recommend taking a generalist course that'll cover a lot of different practices. And as you learn about the various different practices that you can implement, that will help you to think about which specific practices you want to try for your research work. No research group has the time and the resources to do everything at night or everything overnight. And there's also a learning curve here where you start, you find some problems, you have to figure out how to address those problems, how to best navigate for this specific research application that you're using. And you learn and you build and you adapt your practices over time. So my advice would be, in general, find a generalist course. There may be something at your institution, there may be something at your society. There's definitely a lot of material available online. Our Reproducibility Teach course would be one example of that. Reproducibility for Everyone also offers generalist courses. Learn about a lot of practices, and then we published a 10 Simple Rules paper earlier this year, which talks about how to go through the process after this generalist course of figuring out what's on my short list of things that I could implement, and how do I talk to my research team about what makes the most sense for our group to implement. Which things do I pick? And once I've picked, how do I go about actually implementing that thing and adapting to problems and new information and circumstances that come up in the lab or in the research group as we're doing that work? And then how do I further expand my skills to advance my career in the future? The Carpentries is another group that a lot of people like for software issues or issues around open code, open data, and software. And there's also a set of reproducibility journal clubs that may be very helpful. They have a strong psychology focus from their origin, but there are certainly groups at local institutions that run these journal clubs that have a broader focus towards different fields as well.
Wonderful. Perhaps you could maybe tell me a little bit about your perspective on how the move toward open access will affect open science practices and methods. Or will it?
I think that's I would say that in Europe, we're a little bit further along in the open access discussion than perhaps in North America. I think open access was where a lot of things started with. How do we open up the publications? How do we make things more accessible? And from there, people have started to think about other things beyond publications, which is where we get the data, the code, the software, and more recently methods. And so I would say there's a slowly creeping expansion of thinking about what our research products are and then how we can make them open, that in many ways very much started with open access. And certainly there are people that have been working on open data, open codes, open methods, and software for a long time. But I think open access was really valuable in creating a discussion around the general benefits of work being open, both for the scientists who produce it, for the scientists who consume that work, and then also for the rest of society who we would hope would benefit from this work, much of which is publicly funded.
Great. And I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on things that APS journals can be doing in this space. What do you see as the opportunities for our publishing program?
This again is a little bit of a challenging answer because I think every journal has a different editor and a different character, and to some extent it's up to those editors to determine what they feel is most important to the community that they're working with. As a whole, I think that APS journals have a very strong focus on making sure that methods are well reported, that full details are there, that things aren't being hidden away in the supplement. And so I think getting more linking out to protocols and sharing of detailed methods would be a really important step for APS journals to take, and providing support to authors in how to use these repositories and what are the benefits to the scientist of having well-documented methods that they can really cite in their own work would be quite important. Open data is obviously a huge topic of discussion right now with the new NIH guidance coming out. And so that is something that APS and everyone else is now dealing with. And it does require careful consideration. Publishing data sets, you have to think about, are those going to be reviewed? Who has the expertise to do that? And who's going to review it? What kinds of things are they looking for? And how can they do that? So, for example, there's a group called Code Check that will come in, and if you have data and code in your paper, then you can ask them to have a look at your code and confirm that they were able to run it at least once. As the data were being uploaded. And these kinds of checks can be very helpful for you as an author, for just wanting to know that, yeah, this thing that I'm putting out there is working, it's helpful. So those would be two opportunities that I see immediately, but I think there are certainly other opportunities available depending on what is of interest or what is particularly important to certain communities within the very wide APS bubble.
Wonderful. Well, we're almost to the end of our questions, and I just wonder if you have any last thoughts or things that you would like our readership of the Physiologist magazine to know about this broad topic of open science and the work that you're doing on a daily basis and spending your life's work trying to move forward.
Yeah, I think my recommendation for people would be try new things. We have to understand that science is evolving, and what was considered great scientific practice 20 years ago is different from today, just because we have new capabilities and we have new tools and we have new ways of thinking about things. And that's perfectly normal. And so trying out something new doesn't mean that you've been doing it wrong for the last 20 years. It just means that science is changing, and we all want to change with science so that our practices are current and we're doing the best research that we can do. And I think some of this is also about normalizing a culture of transparency and openness. And part of that is understanding that science is messy and it's very complicated, and we all make mistakes. And one of the challenges that we see with investigators who are first sharing their methods is they want to wait until it's perfect and it's done to share. And there's always some new thing that they're adapting it for that they would like to be reflected in the protocol. And that's really great. But methods aren't like publications that focus on results. They're never done. They're constantly evolving. They're constantly adapted for new purposes. They're constantly improved or changed because the reagent isn't available anymore, or you have a new machine now, or a new technique that wasn't available before. And so thinking about documenting these very dynamic outputs in a different way, where instead of there's one version, we're done, it's published, and we never think about it again, we just go to the next study. And we're thinking about code or methods or software, it's much more about dynamic sharing of, this is the version we're using now, and here's the new and improved version that we're using for our next study, and here's our new and improved version and how we've changed it to be able to do something else. So we want to think more about sharing our products as an evolution and not as a static point in time. And to do that, we have to recognize that things are going to change. There's no one perfect product that we can finish and take home and hang on the fridge and say, look, it's done, I'm finished. It's a process. And we know that as scientists, that it's an evolution and a process. So we need to try things. We need to experiment with our science and the practice of it in the same way that we do with our research questions itself. And we need to learn from things that go well from things that didn't go well, from talking to others so we can learn from their mistakes and we don't have to make all the mistakes ourselves.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracey, for joining us. This is such an important topic and a very fast moving one. And so we're very grateful that you have taken the time, and hopefully people will reach out to you to learn more. And we'll make sure that all of the links to the articles that you've mentioned are incorporated into our articles so that folks can read them directly. And with that, I will say goodbye and see you soon. Thanks so much, Tracey.
Thank you very much. And I have questions.